Parents Joe and Rose Kennedy expected success from all 9 of their children. Nothing else was acceptable. They had an image to upkeep and social standards to uphold. Yet, Joe says of his children, "I don't know what it is that makes 8 children shine like a dollar coin and another one dull." There is no doubt he was referring to his third-born, Rosemary. But what would possess a father to say such a thing of his child? The same thing that would possess him to force a lobotomy on her at the age of 23. In this episode, we will learn about the heartbreaking and tragic life of Rosemary Kennedy, the sister of President John F. Kennedy. I'm your host, Rachel Payton, and you're listening to the Chronicles of Time. The wealthy Kennedys were awaiting the arrival of their newest addition in September of 1918. Mother Rose had hired a nurse to assist in the last days of her pregnancy. She was to have a home birth, as she did with her 2 previous births. She would call the doctor to come when she was going into labor. She did just that, except there was a problem. The doctor was truly held up at the hospital due to the raging Spanish influenza that had hit Boston. In the meantime, the nurse would tell Rose to cross her legs in an attempt to prolong labor. This, for obvious reasons, didn't work, so the nurse then spent 2 agonizing hours holding the baby in the birthing canal, causing a lack of oxygen to reach the baby. 2 hours of unnecessary pain, for the nurse had been trained to deliver a baby in an emergency, and I personally call that an emergency. Dr. Frederick L. Good, who would birth all 9 of the Kennedy children, finally arrived at the family home to deliver a seemingly happy and healthy baby girl. They named their first daughter Rosemary, but would go on to call her Rosemary. The troubles of labor washed away with the sight of sweet Rosemary. As the years went on, Joe and Rose continued growing their family. As they did so, they began to notice a difference in Rosemary from the other children. She wasn't hitting key milestones made by her brothers before when they were her age. She struggled learning to talk, and walking was challenging for her. In the 1920s, intellectual disabilities were not known nor accepted the way they are today, and diagnosis was extremely rare. It was a completely different time. For this reason, it was crucial Rosemary did not fall behind. The family included her in everything, and the children knew to accommodate to her. The siblings would become very protective of her. Joe and Rose would spend extra time with Rosemary to ensure she would be able to keep up. They simply wouldn't accept the truth about their daughter. Reality began to set in for the parents when Rosemary went to kindergarten. Teachers began to notice behavioral and intellectual issues and would make her repeat kindergarten. At one point, she took an IQ test, and Rose was told that her daughter scored low. They decided to pull her out of school and hire an at-home tutor to teach Rosemary. But by the age of 11, they sent her to a boarding school for intellectual disabilities in Philadelphia. Rose and Joe had a tendency of not telling the teachers of Rosemary's condition, instead letting them become aware on their own. Ultimately, this outraged the teachers. She would go on to attend a total of 5 different schools during the years of 1929 to 1938. In 1930, during her vulnerable teenage years, her parents allowed a doctor to give her hormone injections in an attempt to quote-unquote cure her. This, of course, didn't work. Joe Kennedy was appointed ambassador of the United Kingdom in 1938 by Franklin D. Roosevelt. During this time, he moved the family with him overseas. These years may perhaps be the happiest and best of Rosemary's life. She was enrolled in a Montessori school and making tremendous progress. But she would grow agitated and confused when she was at balls and parties and could only dance with her brothers. She wanted more, but Joe couldn't risk Rosemary making a fool of the family. They eventually just stopped taking Rosemary with them to occasions altogether. World War II would force the Kennedy clan back to the States, but due to Rosemary's progression, she was the last to go back with Joe. This may be the beginning of the end for sweet Rosemary. When she arrived back, she was in and out of camps and schools. During this time, she was having violent outbursts and escaping during the night. Her progress was regressing. Her sister Eunice would write, at 22, she was becoming increasingly irritable and difficult. Father Joe's solution was to have a lobotomy performed on Rosemary. Rose would ask her daughter Kick to see if the procedure was a good idea. Once she looked into it, she told Rose that it wasn't a good idea to do to Rosemary. The procedure of a lobotomy was controversial even then. It had only been performed in the States for a few years. A father, husband, or son could take a woman to get a lobotomy against her will at any time. Joe would make the decision alone, without consulting a soul. It was decided, a lobotomy for the 23-year-old Rosemary. The procedure was performed at George Washington University Hospital and was done by Dr. Walter J. Freeman and Dr. James Watts. In the book, Sins of the Father, Dr. Watts says, "We went through the top of her head. I think she was awake. She had a mild tranquilizer. We made an estimate of how far to cut based on how she responded. She did not respond well at all. In fact, they shaved her head and strapped her to a table while they drilled into both sides of her head." Rosemary's cousin, Anne Grogan, said of the lobotomy, "They knew right away it wasn't successful. You could see by looking at her that something was wrong. For her head was tilted and her capacity to speak was almost entirely gone. Before the procedure, she had a mental capacity of a 4th grader, but it was now reduced to a preschooler, if not worse. She was unable to walk or talk. Instead of taking responsibility for what he has done to Rosemary, Joe puts her in a psychiatric hospital in New York for nearly a decade. After that, he moves her to a Catholic institution in Jefferson, Wisconsin. There, she would relearn how to somewhat talk and walk. Kennedy children were told not to ask about Rosemary. The family was to say she was teaching in the Midwest. Joe would never visit his daughter. It wasn't until Joe had a stroke in 1961 when the family would begin visiting Rosemary. In 1962, Rose would go see her daughter after 20 years. When Rosemary saw her mother, she began to beat on her chest and cry, a daughter who was so hurt by being left alone her whole life. Her siblings would discover where she is and wanted a relationship with her. They would visit often and even bring Rosemary on vacations. Her sister Eunice found the Special Olympics, and it was no doubt that it was an inspiration from her sister. Rosemary would live until 2005. She was 86 when she passed away from natural causes, with all 4 remaining siblings by her side. She passed away in Wisconsin, where she had lived for over 50 years since her father dropped her off in 1948. The story of Rosemary Kennedy is a heartbreaking tragedy. It shows how willing Joe Kennedy was to go at any lengths to hide his secret. He would hide his daughter to ensure a secure social status. Rosemary Kennedy deserved more. The family had financial means to give her a good life and get her help, but they decided she was too much of a burden on them. May sweet Rosemary live on as long as JFK, Bobby, or Ted does, for it's the least she deserves. Thank you for listening to this episode of Rosemary Kennedy. If you want to know more about Rosemary, author Kate Clifford Larson wrote a detailed biography on her life called Rosemary, the Hidden Kennedy Daughter. If you want more content or updates, go follow my Instagram and Facebook page. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave a rating and review. New episodes come out every Wednesday. And lastly, if you have any suggestions or comments, new episodes come out every Wednesday. And lastly, if you have any suggestions, comments, or questions, you can always email me at thechroniclesoftimepodcast@gmail.com. As always, I'm your host, Rachel Payton, and you've listened to The Chronicles of Time.